In the history of American crime, few names carry the weight, fear, and fascination of Al Capone. This is not the story of the kingpin at the height of his power, nor the downfall that would later shock the nation. This is the beginning, the roots of a legend, how an immigrant boy from Brooklyn slowly transformed into the most feared gangster of the Prohibition era. To understand Al Capone's rise, one must first return to the harsh streets where his character was forged, long before Chicago, bootlegging empires, and national headlines. Al Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, as Alphonse Gabriel Capone, the son of Italian immigrants struggling to survive in a crowded and unforgiving city. His father worked as a barber, earning just enough to keep the family afloat, while his mother took in sewing to help support their large household. Life in Brooklyn's immigrant neighborhoods offered little comfort and even less mercy. Crime, poverty, and street violence were part of daily life, and young Capone learned early that strength often mattered more than rules. Capone attended school only briefly. Though not unintelligent, he was impatient with authority and discipline. His temper and defiance eventually led to a violent confrontation with a teacher, resulting in his expulsion. That moment quietly ended any chance of a conventional future and pushed Capone fully into the streets, where respect was earned through fear and survival depended on reputation. With no school and no clear path forward, he found belonging among local street gangs that offered protection, identity, and power. As a teenager, Capone drifted through Brooklyn's criminal circles, learning the mechanics of intimidation, loyalty, and organized violence. His path eventually led him to the 5 Points Gang, one of New York City's most influential and dangerous criminal organizations. This gang was more than a collection of thugs, it was a breeding ground for future crime bosses and political power brokers. Within its ranks, Capone began to understand that true power came not from chaos, but from structure and control. It was during this time that Capone crossed paths with Johnny Torrio, a calm, strategic criminal who would become the most important mentor of his early life. Torrio recognized something different in Capone, an unusual combination of physical presence, loyalty, and ambition. Unlike many young gangsters, Capone listened, learned, and followed orders with discipline. Under Torrio's influence, he began to see crime not just as violence, but as a business that required planning, alliances, and patience. Around this period, Capone worked at a bar in Coney Island, a volatile environment filled with alcohol, criminals, and unpredictable confrontations. One night, a reckless comment toward a woman triggered a violent response from her brother, who slashed Capone's face with a knife. The scars that remained would earn him the nickname, Scarface. Though the name became infamous, Capone hated it, seeing the scars as a reminder of humiliation. Yet the incident hardened him, reinforcing a belief that disrespect could never go unanswered. By his late teens, Capone was no longer just another street tough. He had earned a reputation as a reliable enforcer, someone who could be trusted in dangerous situations and who showed absolute loyalty to his superiors. Johnny Torrio, already looking westward for greater opportunities, began preparing for a move that would change everything. America was on the brink of prohibition, and the illegal alcohol trade promised unimaginable profits for those bold enough to seize control. As Capone stood at this turning point, he could not yet see the empire that awaited him, but the foundations were already in place. The streets of Brooklyn had taught him brutality, loyalty, and survival. His mentors had taught him strategy and patience. And soon, a new city would offer him the stage on which he would begin his transformation from a street gangster into a criminal legend, one whose name would become forever linked with power, fear, and the darkest chapters of American history. In Part 2, the city of Chicago itself becomes a living, breathing character in Al Capone's rise, because without Chicago, there is no Capone as history remembers him. When Al Capone arrived in the city in the early 1920s, Chicago was already unstable, but the passage of the Volstead Act and the start of Prohibition turned that instability into opportunity. Alcohol was suddenly illegal, yet demand exploded overnight, and Capone immediately understood what many others only sensed: Prohibition was not about law, it was about control. Behind the scenes, Johnny Torrio had already begun shaping a sophisticated criminal enterprise, one that relied not only on violence but on organization, bribery, and political influence. Torrio saw something rare in Capone, not just muscle, but intelligence, ambition, and an instinct for scale, and he brought him deeper into the outfit's operations, giving him responsibilities that extended far beyond street-level enforcement. Capone learned quickly how liquor moved from Canadian borders through hidden warehouses, how trucks were rerouted when police pressure increased, how speakeasies were protected, and most importantly, how politicians and police captains were quietly placed on payrolls to ensure smooth operations. As Capone's influence grew, so did his reputation for decisiveness. He understood that fear alone was unreliable, it had to be reinforced with certainty. When rival gangs tested outfit territory, Capone did not respond impulsively, he responded strategically. He approved targeted strikes that sent unmistakable messages, ensuring that violence served purpose rather than chaos. This approach transformed the outfit into a disciplined machine, where orders flowed from the top and loyalty was rewarded with protection and wealth. Capone's presence at meetings became legendary. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was with absolute clarity. Those sitting across from him knew that negotiations were not suggestions but conclusions already reached. At the same time, Capone cultivated a public image that confused both journalists and law enforcement. He appeared generous, funding soup kitchens, tipping waiters extravagantly, and presenting himself as a businessman rather than a criminal. This dual identity, ruthless behind closed doors, charming in public, allowed him to operate openly while remaining untouchable. The outfit's bootlegging profits skyrocketed into the tens of millions, and with that wealth came expansion. Capone oversaw the acquisition of breweries, trucking companies, and distribution hubs, turning illegal alcohol into an industrial-scale operation. Entire neighborhoods became economically dependent on the outfit's presence, creating a silent alliance between criminals and civilians who benefited from steady work and protection. Yet beneath this apparent stability, pressure was building. Rival factions resented Capone's dominance, and internal tensions simmered as ambitious lieutenants sought greater power. Capone recognized these threats early and responded by tightening his inner circle, relying only on men whose loyalty had been tested under extreme circumstances. Meetings became more secretive, security more elaborate, and discipline more severe. Anyone suspected of betrayal disappeared quietly, reinforcing the belief that betrayal was not an option. This period marked Capone's full transformation, from Torrio's protege into Chicago's undisputed power broker. When Torrio was seriously wounded in an assassination attempt and later decided to step back, the transition of power was seamless. Capone did not seize control, it was handed to him, a testament to the authority he had already established. Now at the top, he expanded the outfit's reach even further, integrating gambling, prostitution, and labor racketeering into a single interconnected empire. Every operation fed into the next, creating a network so complex that dismantling it seemed impossible. Law enforcement struggled to respond, raids failed, witnesses vanished, and juries were compromised long before trials began. To many in Chicago, Capone was no longer just a gangster, he was a force of nature, shaping the city's economy, politics, and daily life from the shadows. Yet this dominance came at a cost. The more powerful Capone became, the more visible he was, and visibility attracted enemies on every level. Federal authorities began shifting their strategy, realizing that traditional policing would never be enough. Journalists intensified their scrutiny, turning Capone into a national symbol of organized crime, while rival gangs quietly regrouped, waiting for a moment of weakness. Capone sensed that the game was changing, that the rules which had protected him might soon be rewritten. Still, he pressed forward, convinced that control, intimidation, and careful planning would keep him ahead of both rivals and the law. As Chicago stood at the height of its violent prosperity, Al Capone sat firmly at the center of it all, unaware that the very empire he had built with such precision was drawing him closer to confrontations that would define not just his reign, but his eventual downfall, a turning point that was already forming in the shadows and waiting for its moment to strike. By the time Al Capone's power reached its peak, Chicago had entered its most violent and unstable chapter, a period when control of territory meant everything and even the smallest shift in balance could trigger a citywide war. Capone now ruled an empire that stretched far beyond bootlegging, but dominance brought exposure, and exposure brought enemies who were willing to risk everything to challenge him. Rival gangs, particularly those operating on the north side, viewed Capone's expansion as an existential threat. What followed was not random violence but a calculated struggle for supremacy, where every assassination, every ambush, and every public confrontation was designed to weaken the other side's grip on Chicago's criminal economy. Capone understood that these conflicts could not be allowed to spiral out of control, because chaos threatened profits, and profits were the foundation of his authority. As tensions escalated, he authorized a series of strategic moves meant to isolate his enemies, cutting off their supply lines, bribing their allies, and turning informants within their ranks. At the same time, Capone faced increasing pressure from law enforcement, who were no longer content with chasing street-level criminals. Federal agencies began coordinating efforts, gathering financial records, tracking shipments, and building cases that targeted the structure of the outfit rather than individual acts of violence. Capone responded by reinforcing his insulation from direct involvement. Orders were relayed through trusted intermediaries, meetings were relocated to secure locations, and communication became deliberately vague, ensuring plausible deniability at every level. This period revealed Capone's adaptability. He was not simply reacting to threats but anticipating them, adjusting his methods to stay ahead of both rivals and authorities. Yet even with these precautions, the violence on the streets intensified, drawing national attention and transforming Chicago into a symbol of Prohibition-era lawlessness. Newspapers across the country printed Capone's name repeatedly, turning him into a public figure whose notoriety rivaled that of movie stars and politicians. As public scrutiny grew, Capone attempted to control the narrative. He granted interviews, appeared at social events, and presented himself as a misunderstood businessman targeted by sensationalist media. This carefully crafted image served two purposes. It reassured allies who depended on his leadership, and it complicated efforts by prosecutors to portray him as a criminal mastermind. However, behind this public facade, Capone's private life became increasingly constrained. Security tightened around him, movements were planned in advance, and paranoia crept into his inner circle. Trust, once the backbone of the outfit, became fragile, as even longtime associates were viewed through the lens of potential betrayal. Capone compensated by relying on fear and loyalty in equal measure, rewarding obedience while making examples of those who crossed him. The climax of this violent era came with a series of events that reshaped the underworld permanently, demonstrating both the height of Capone's power and the limits of his control. These incidents sent shockwaves through criminal organizations nationwide, forcing other gangs to reconsider their strategies and alliances. Capone emerged from these confrontations with his dominance temporarily reinforced, but the cost was undeniable. The bloodshed intensified calls for federal intervention, and political pressure mounted to bring an end to Chicago's reign of terror. Capone could feel the walls closing in, not through a single dramatic threat, but through a gradual tightening of options. His empire still generated immense wealth, his name still commanded fear, but the environment that had allowed him to rise was changing rapidly. The same city that had fueled his ascent was beginning to turn against him, setting the stage for confrontations that would test not only his power, but his ability to survive in a world where visibility had become his greatest vulnerability, and where every decision carried consequences that could no longer be controlled indefinitely. As Al Capone's influence continued to expand, the balance of power in Chicago began to fracture under the weight of constant violence and growing fear. The city was no longer just a battleground between rival gangs, it had become a complex web of political corruption, police bribery, and underground economics where every decision made in the shadows echoed loudly in public life. Capone's organization had perfected the system of bootlegging distribution, controlling breweries, transportation routes, and speakeasies with near-military precision, but this efficiency only intensified resentment among rival factions who felt slowly strangled by his dominance. The North Side gangs, in particular, refused to accept Capone's authority, and their resistance hardened into a cycle of retaliatory killings that pushed Chicago closer to all-out gang warfare. Each assassination was calculated, designed not only to remove an enemy but to send a message that control of the city was non-negotiable. Capone himself became increasingly aware that power now carried a different cost. His name was no longer whispered only in back rooms, it was shouted in headlines, debated in political offices, and feared by ordinary citizens who saw the effects of gang violence on their streets. This visibility forced Capone to evolve once again. He reduced his direct involvement in day-to-day operations, delegating authority to trusted lieutenants while focusing on maintaining unity within his organization. Loyalty was rewarded lavishly, but betrayal was met with swift and unforgiving consequences. Capone understood that fear alone was not enough to hold an empire together, he needed discipline, structure, and a clear chain of command to prevent internal collapse. During this period, the Chicago outfit began to resemble a corporate organization as much as a criminal one, with defined roles, controlled communication, and strict enforcement of rules. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies were adapting as well. Local police, long compromised by bribes and political pressure, were increasingly overshadowed by federal investigators who viewed Capone as a symbol of Prohibition's failure. These investigators focused less on violent crimes, which were difficult to prosecute, and more on financial irregularities that could expose the inner workings of Capone's empire. Tax records, property ownership, and unexplained wealth became weapons against him, quietly assembled while Capone remained focused on external threats. This shift went largely unnoticed by Capone's rivals, who continued to fight openly in the streets, unaware that a more subtle and dangerous strategy was taking shape. Within the criminal underworld, Capone's reputation reached near mythical status. Stories of his rise, his ruthlessness, and his strategic mind spread far beyond Chicago, influencing how other gangs across America operated. Some sought alliances, hoping to benefit from his protection, while others prepared defenses, fearing that his reach would eventually extend into their territories. Capone was now more than a gang leader, he was a benchmark against which all other criminal figures were measured. Yet despite this dominance, cracks were beginning to form beneath the surface. The constant pressure, the endless vigilance, and the growing sense that his world was narrowing began to take their toll. Capone's empire still stood strong, but the conditions that had allowed it to flourish were shifting, and the forces gathering against him were no longer limited to rival gangs or corrupt officials. Unseen and relentless, they were preparing to challenge him in a way that violence could not stop, pushing Capone toward a future where power alone would no longer guarantee survival. By the early 1930s, the world around Al Capone was changing faster than he was willing to admit. Prohibition, the very law that had fueled his rise, was beginning to show cracks, and with it came a shift in public opinion. What was once seen by many as harmless rebellion against an unpopular ban was now viewed as a source of unchecked violence, corruption, and social decay. Chicago, exhausted by years of bloodshed, had become the focal point of national outrage, and Capone stood at the center of that anger as the most visible symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Politicians, journalists, and federal authorities no longer treated him as just another gangster. He had become a national problem that demanded a decisive response. While Capone continued to project confidence in public, privately his position was becoming increasingly fragile. The outfit still generated enormous wealth, but maintaining control now required constant vigilance. Trusted lieutenants were stretched thin managing both external threats and internal discipline, and paranoia crept deeper into Capone's inner circle. Meetings became shorter, locations changed frequently, and conversations were carefully worded, as everyone understood that informants could be anywhere. Capone sensed that violence, once his most effective tool, was losing its power. Every shooting now brought more scrutiny, more federal interest, and more pressure from a public desperate for stability. The streets that once bowed to his name were now crawling with investigators who were no longer interested in bribes or quiet arrangements. Federal authorities had shifted their strategy with ruthless patience. Instead of pursuing Capone for murders or bootlegging, crimes that relied heavily on unreliable witnesses, they focused on something far more dangerous: his finances. Years of meticulous record-keeping, surveillance, and quiet investigation were beginning to pay off. Accountants, clerks, and minor associates were questioned, pressured, and, in some cases, turned into sources of information. Capone, who had built his empire on cash and intimidation, underestimated the power of paperwork. He believed that without witnesses willing to testify about violence, the government had little chance of bringing him down. This miscalculation would prove to be one of the most critical errors of his career. As the legal net tightened, Capone attempted to adapt once more. He increased his charitable donations, funded public kitchens during the Great Depression, and made deliberate efforts to appear as a benefactor to struggling communities. To some, he seemed like a complex figure, a criminal, yet also a provider in desperate times. But these gestures could not erase the growing evidence quietly assembling against him. Behind closed doors, prosecutors were building a case that did not rely on fear or loyalty, but on numbers, ledgers, and undeniable financial discrepancies. Capone's fame, once his shield, had become his weakness. Every move he made was now closely watched, every asset scrutinized. When the final blow came, it did not arrive with gunfire or gang warfare, but with court summons and federal charges that struck at the heart of his empire. Capone found himself facing a system that could not be bribed or intimidated in the ways he was accustomed to. The courtroom replaced the streets as the new battleground, and for the first time, Capone was forced to fight on unfamiliar ground. His conviction marked the collapse of an era, signaling the end of unchecked gangster rule during Prohibition and reshaping how organized crime would operate in the future. Al Capone's rise had been built on violence, strategy, and opportunity, but his fall demonstrated a harsh reality. No matter how powerful a man becomes in the shadows, the structures of society, once fully mobilized, can still bring even the most feared kingpin to account. This final chapter did not erase his legacy, instead, it cemented him as a permanent figure in American history, a symbol of both the excesses of Prohibition and the inevitable limits of criminal power. Al Capone's final years were marked not by the roar of gunfire or the thrill of absolute power, but by a slow, relentless unraveling that no amount of money, fear, or reputation could stop. After his conviction, the man who once ruled Chicago's underworld found himself stripped of the very tools that had defined his life. Prison walls replaced luxury hotels, armed bodyguards were replaced by guards who answered to the state, and the empire that had once generated millions now existed only in memories and fading newspaper headlines. For Capone, confinement was not just a physical punishment, it was a psychological collapse. Used to commanding loyalty and obedience with a glance or a word, he now lived under constant supervision, powerless to influence events beyond his cell. As time passed, Capone's health began to deteriorate rapidly. Years of excess, stress, and untreated illness took their toll, and the sharp, calculating mind that had once outmaneuvered rivals and authorities alike began to fade. Fellow inmates and prison officials noticed changes in his behavior, confusion, disorientation, and moments where the feared gangster seemed disconnected from reality. The legend of Al Capone, once so carefully constructed through fear and spectacle, was now confronted with a cruel irony. The man who had survived countless gang wars was being undone quietly, by time and disease. His release from prison did not mark a return to power, but rather the beginning of a long retreat from the world he once dominated. In his final years, Capone lived in near isolation, far removed from the criminal networks that had continued without him. Organized crime adapted, evolved, and moved on, learning from both his success and his downfall. New leaders emerged who understood the lessons of Capone's life, that visibility was dangerous, that violence attracted attention, and that the future of organized crime depended on secrecy and insulation rather than public notoriety. Capone, once the model of power, had become a cautionary tale studied by those who followed in his footsteps. His name still commanded recognition, but no longer fear. It had transformed into a symbol of an era that could never fully return. When Al Capone finally died, the reaction was complex and divided. To some, he was a criminal responsible for untold suffering, violence, and corruption. To others, he remained a darkly fascinating figure, a product of Prohibition and a broken system that allowed criminals to thrive. Historians would later debate whether Capone was the cause of America's gangster era or simply its most visible consequence. What could not be denied was his impact. He reshaped how crime, law enforcement, and the public interacted, forcing the federal government to modernize its approach to organized crime and proving that even the most powerful criminal empires had limits. The legacy of Al Capone endures not because of the wealth he amassed or the enemies he defeated, but because his life represents a collision between opportunity and consequence. He rose at a moment when laws were unenforceable, institutions were corruptible, and violence could buy power, but he fell when those same institutions adapted and turned their full attention against him. His story is not just the tale of a gangster, but a reflection of American society during one of its most turbulent periods, a reminder that legends are often born from chaos, and that even the most feared figures eventually face a reckoning they cannot escape. With Capone's fall, the curtain closed on the most infamous chapter of the Prohibition era, leaving behind a story that continues to captivate, warn, and fascinate generations long after the last shot was fired and the last speakeasy went dark.